Welcome to part 2 of our 3-part webinar series, Information in the Digital Age. Our first session last month focused on how technology impacts journalism, journalism ethics, and the role of fact-checking. Next session on August 26th, we are going to be speaking about disinformation specifically. And today, we are centered on new media and misinformation, examining the prevalence of misinformation and its global implications, including the impact of misinformation in Zambia specifically, as well as the role of open internet and practical tips and tools to improve media literacy and decipher between fact and fiction. My name is Alannah Crandall, and my co-collaborators on this webinar series are Kim Todd and Courtney Herlock. Courtney and I are from Global Ties San Francisco, and we implement the U.S. Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, or IVLP, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Kim implements these programs in the Sacramento area for World Trade Center, Northern California. We have 3 wonderful panelists today. The first is Richard Mulonga, who is the founder and CEO of Bloggers of Zambia, leading online and offline advocacy campaign, #OpenSpaceZM, for democratic internet laws, policies, and regulations in Zambia and Africa at large. Through this campaign, he has mobilized journalists, bloggers, techies, citizens, policymakers, and legislators to debate internet governance. Richard provides media literacy and digital security strategies to have a democratic internet ecosystem that promotes digital rights. In 2019, Richard participated in the U.S. Department of State's IVLP on advancing an open, reliable, and secure digital economy, administered by Meridian International Center in Washington, D.C., and implemented locally by Global Ties San Francisco. Molly Dugan is a professor of journalism and communication studies at California State University, Sacramento, where she teaches upper-level classes in public affairs reporting, internet media, media literacy, race, and social justice and mass communication. Molly's recent research involves government and political reporting, press freedom, and journalism ethics. Molly spent more than a decade as a staff writer at newspapers, including the Sacramento Bee, the Press Enterprise, and the Modesto Bee. She has a bachelor's degree in comparative literature from the University of California, Davis, and a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. Finally, our third panelist today is Mark Graham, the director of the Wayback Machine at the nonprofit Internet Archive, where he is responsible for archiving much of the public web. He also leads the Internet Archive's efforts to weave books into the web. Before that, he was an SVP with NBC News Digital, where he managed several of their digital properties, including a startup live mobile video service for citizen reporting. He has managed many of the world's largest online communities in the domains of peace, environment, gardening, women, and general conversations. He developed AOL's Internet Center, which introduced the first few million people to the internet. Mark's volunteer activities include technical consulting to an education nonprofit, which has built an open education discovery and authoring platform, as well as a network of innovators committed to ending the nuclear threat. For today, we're going to start with a few definitions, so we're all on the same page. We're going to start with a definition of information. Information is knowledge that is obtained from investigation, study, or instruction. It's otherwise known as intelligence, news, facts, or data. Misinformation is incorrect or misleading information, information that is not completely true or accurate. The first known use of this word is 1605. And disinformation is false information deliberately and often covertly spread, as by the planting of rumors, for instance, in order to influence public opinion or obscure the truth. It is false information that is given to people in order to make them believe something or to hide the truth. And the first known use of this word is 1939. Lastly, media literacy is the ability to identify different types of media and understand the messages that they are sending. Media literacy, one of our topics for today, helps us learn to think critically, become a smart consumer of products and information, recognize points of view, create media responsibly, identify the role of media in our culture, and understand the author's goal. And as a heads up, we are not going to be using the term fake news here, and we will stick to specifying misinformation and disinformation as much as possible. Please be aware that it's not a straight, clear line all of the time. It's a gray area between the two. So if you feel like that might apply, something we say might apply to disinformation just as much as misinformation, you might be correct on that. But stay tuned for next 2 weeks from now, our next session on August 26th, which focuses on disinformation. And you'll get a lot more on that at that time. Thank you. Now I'm going to send it over to Richard to begin his discussion.
Thank you so much for meeting up, and greetings from Zambia. And thank you very much for reconnecting with Global Ties. It's almost a year now. And yes, I'm going to address 3 things: misinformation in Zambia, media literacy strategies, and the role of an open internet from our perspective. So usually misinformation in Zambia is often vague. Because it has become more political than anything else because of the open nature. It's actually what I'm going to discuss later on, the disruption, how the internet is disrupting the narrative. So often misinformation is vague, it's not defined. So anyone who doesn't like what the agenda that you're pushing or what you have said, they can, because they're popular or maybe they are an influential government official, they would call it misinformation and just meant to discredit, the person who is saying that. So you find that that strategy has misinformation. The word misinformation is vague, and it is used to discredit, for example, independent and investigative journalism, and those activists and defenders who, for example, are speaking truth to power. And because the politicians are powerful, they politicize everything and they punch holes using terms like fake news that we have decided not to use here, because even ourselves, we don't agree with it. That news can never be fake. News is news, and if any information is not true, let's give it that name. So usually we have seen a lot of government troll farms, usually political troll farms, both in the ruling party and in the opposition, and there's a lot of information that is being exchanged basically in the political crossfire to gain popularity, because here we believe that, the battle for democracy, the contestation for power is online, and everyone, because they have the power of gatekeeping, they can decide what they want to publish. So we have a lot of information, or especially online, and even in the traditional media, radio and TV, especially in the public media, there's a lot of information that is not verified, and it is basically used for popularity purposes. So we are looking at how is all this, the technology and the 4IR, the fourth industrial revolution, how it is contributing to all this. Misinformation is a big issue in Zambia now, because we're going towards an election next year, actually on 12th August, because it's enshrined in our constitution. And everyone, especially under COVID times, everyone is trying to be popular. Everyone is trying to spread their popularity around, and there's a lot of information that is being shared that is misleading, especially even including information on COVID-19. There's a lot of information that is being spread, and unfortunately, misinformation actually in Zambia is even perpetrated from the highest office itself, from the office of the president, because recently the president on his Facebook page shared a photograph purporting to be a road that is building. And because of the media literacy services, for example, that we are providing and other people are providing, there was some fact checking. And after fact verifying, it was actually a road in Nigeria. So you can tell that misinformation actually is not only about citizens that are fighting about all this and that, but it's actually the president himself. So you can see that misinformation actually has become the currency to gain popularity, especially when it comes to the contestation for power. And when it comes to media literacy strategies, actually the biggest thing that is going on now is to build the capacity of journalists, of activists, human rights defenders, lawyers, citizens, young people, including university and college students, that they may have the capacity to fact check. They may be able to verify themselves actually before they consume certain information, and also before they publish any information, they must verify that it is credible and it is true. And that is what is working. And as you can see, for example, in the instance that I gave about the president posting fake photographs. Also, we are rolling out basic cybersecurity and hygiene strategies to make the internet safe for everyone, especially women and girls and young people. Misinformation sometimes is perpetrated by troll farms and hackers who hack into spaces for digital rights defenders, for activists and all that, and they begin to take advantage of that to perpetrate information that is creating a lot of problems in the democracy, in the digital economy. Also, basically, we are because the internet was not started this side of the equator, and so based on what we know, we are trying to also inform and educate others. For example, how the internet works, how radio and television works, especially the internet, because everyone is running to the internet now to take their conversation there, because radio is highly regulated here, unfair regulation, and some voices are not able to participate in democracy. Those that speak truth to power are arrested and jailed. So everyone is going to the internet that is open, that is free, that is accessible. But within that, there's a lot of illiteracy about how the internet works. People sometimes think the internet is anonymous. We have a recent case of a senior cabinet minister who shared his nude photographs and he just got fired. He didn't know how the internet works and how social media works, and he just embarrassed himself and the whole government. So we are educating especially young people about how the internet, how it was started, who is Tim Berners-Lee, how the internet works globally, how the internet works regionally, the regional internet registries and the domain name systems, how to be safe and secure. And within that, also how we can promote, for example, the right to free expression, peaceful assembly and association, because of all that is going on. The public order laws are stopping people from meeting and accessing information and sharing opinions and ideas. So everyone is going to the internet to get that kind of information. So what kind of information are we putting online, and what kind of information are we accessing online? So that is what we are doing under our media literacy. And yeah, basically it's focused largely on the internet, because we have grown up with radio and TV, and people are finding that to be boring because of what is going on. That even among journalists themselves, the level of professionalism, the public trust in journalism is really dwindling. So everyone is going to the internet, and it's like people are orphans. They just have to find their credible information, and it's so hard. Yeah. Now, when it comes to the role of an open internet, and that forms the bulk of our work, and it's growing in Zambia because the internet has become popular. It is being targeted by the government. It's being targeted by the ICT regulator. It's being targeted by the law enforcement, the police. The internet is being targeted even by the broadcasting, radio and TV broadcasting regulator, because they just issued a statement that they are in charge of regulating anything that is broadcast in Zambia, including Facebook Live, and we found that to be outrageous. It defeats democracy. It threatens digital rights. It threatens actually the democracy that is thriving around, because people are first using the internet to express themselves. Freedom of expression is the engine of democracy. If here we say that a child that does not cry dies on the mother's back, so how do you demand your right to education, health, and so on and so forth if you cannot speak? How do we hold our leaders accountable if we cannot speak? And we're using the internet, to speak truth to power. And the internet is targeted by this wave of repressive online internet laws and policies that is engulfing Africa. And so we have engaged parliamentarians, policymakers themselves, the leading ministries, the technocrats. We have mobilized a core team of civil society and activists, including students, women and girls, that they must defend the internet, because for us, the internet, especially social media, has created alternative spaces for citizen engagement. The citizens, as I've said, cannot meet traditionally. Radio and TV does not include certain voices because because of the intolerance, because of the impunity and the lack of adherence to the rule of law that is going on. So we feel that the concept of an open internet is the future. The battle for democracy, as stated earlier, is going online. And if we are going to have laws and policies that are going to make citizens pay 30 units every day to access Facebook, which is free, Twitter and all these other platforms, we feel that those are strategies. The digital authoritarianism that we keep talking about, those are strategies that are meant to filter the internet, for example, in terms of cost, because women and girls, there's this, for example, income inequality. There are all these inequalities that disadvantage people, especially as you move from the city going to the rural areas. The cost of the internet, it becomes expensive and all that. And also, there's a lot of fear. The government, for example, and the regulator and the police, they are in the threatening, issuing statements, for example, Trojan statements like, we are going to be registering WhatsApp admin rights. The admin for WhatsApp groups will have to be registering that we are seeing what you're doing on WhatsApp. You know, we believe that WhatsApp is encrypted and the government has got no capacity to see the content. So citizens, because of the lack of knowledge on how the internet works and encryption and so on and so forth, they begin to be afraid. They begin to run away from the internet, going back, for example, to be fed on, I can call it hogwash, in the public media that is just meant to mislead the people instead of providing spaces for citizens to engage. So we have been doing a lot of work. Our hashtag, like you mentioned earlier on, open space CM, where our motto is keeping online spaces open, because we believe the internet should never be gagged. The internet does not belong to anyone. We believe it doesn't. The issue about regulating the internet, that does not exist in our vocabulary. We feel the internet must be governed. And if you look at the concept of internet governance, it takes a multi-stakeholder approach. It's not only the parliament that must make laws. It's not only the police must enforce these laws. It's not only the regulator that must use these laws to regulate the internet. We feel that we must participate in law and policy development. We feel that we must participate in everything internet, because that is the future. We feel the battle for democracy is on the internet, and the internet must be free and open for all. It must be left to be inclusive as it is always been, and it must be allowed to help our democracy grow. It must be allowed to promote participation and inclusion in governance processes and generally to defend the democracy that we talk about. Thank you so much.
Incredibly interesting. Thank you so much, Richard. You spoke about a lot of really fantastic points that are important for all of us to recognize, including that freedom of expression is, like you said, the engine of democracy. So thank you so much. Molly, go ahead, please.
I'm not sure how to follow that, Richard, but we spoke a few days ago, which was wonderful. And one of the things that I noticed in Zambia, he talks about the fight for an open internet and internet access. And one of the things is the ideas of repression in Zambia are causing misinformation, but some of the lack of any kind of some would say responsibility from the social media companies, or the lack of any regulation in the US is also causing misinformation. And so I think it's really interesting that you can see misinformation occurring in multiple places, but from very different causes. Of course, this week, many of you have probably been reading over the last couple of weeks, some of the major internet players have been called before Congress about running monopolies. And it'll be really interesting to see if there will be any point in which social media companies will start engaging in some kind of governance over misinformation. It hasn't really happened on a large scale yet. Twitter has taken down a few things. Facebook is talking about it, but it hasn't really happened on a large scale, and I'm not really sure what it's going to take for that to happen, given some of the irregularities we've experienced in some of the misinformation that has become really prominent. So I just think that what Richard said was really interesting. But I thought that maybe I would take us back a little bit and talk about some of the various definitions, sort of a little bit more about what Alannah said. And I know that we said that we weren't going to say fake news, but I'm breaking that promise because that's how, and part of the reason is because that's the terminology that a lot of people use, right? And fake news is disinformation, as Alannah talked about, right? With the intent to deceive, and it's really about intention. And that's one of the things that's really important to recognize. And it's not just in terms of issues of democracy. That's, of course, in elections, that's, of course, what we are most concerned about in this Zoom room together. But there's a lot of fake news that has really no purpose at all, but is just general misinformation. Misinformation, this general untruths, it's been around for a long time. The difference is with the power of social media, anybody can post anything. I mean, provided they have open internet access. And so what that has meant is that when it used to be that a newspaper, a radio station, a television, at least in the US, could or would try, legitimate journalists would try to fact check falsehoods that went out there. Now it takes a long time to do that. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology did a really widespread study in 2018 and found that lies spread 6 times faster than truth on the internet, because lies are more interesting, right? And they fit people's preconceived notions about things sometimes. And so it's much harder for the truth to keep up in an environment where information travels so quickly as it does through the internet. So, but one of the other problems is there are several barriers to information, to good information. Fake news and disinformation, that's only one barrier, right? When you have people that are intending to mislead. There are other barriers to our understanding as well that sometimes get confused with fake news but are not the same thing. So for instance, mistakes. Legitimate journalists make mistakes, particularly on deadline, as and the demand for news becomes faster. Those mistakes are generally corrected. They are not the same thing as fake news. They're not intentional, and a legitimate news organization or legitimate journalists will do their best to correct them. But it's still, mistakes are still a barrier to understanding and a barrier to information. Oftentimes lumped in, however, with fake news. There's also opinion. An opinion is sometimes misconstrued as being misinformation, but it's opinion. The Pew Research Center also did a study in 2019, I believe, it might have been late 2018, that showed that only about 30% of American adults can correctly identify 5 statements of fact and 5 statements of opinion. That we are and it's actually nonpartisan. Democrats and Republicans failed at largely the same number, and that we are much more likely to see an opinion as being a fact if it's something that we already agree with. And so opinion is sometimes considered misinformation. It's not, it's somebody's opinion. And opinion is something that is a legitimate form of communication. So, but the idea that opinion and fact can be mistaken is one more barrier to information. And then finally, I call these my four barriers: fake news, mistake, opinion, and then finally bias is the next one. Because bias is oftentimes, again, confused with misinformation. Bias is true. Bias is true. What it is a partial truth. So there's nothing if you took a piece and said that that's biased, you can't really fact check it. in a way. You can't correct it necessarily, because by its very nature, bias isn't incorrect. It's just telling you part of the story. It's cutting the quote off, you know, before the person gets to the point. It's only telling you about the fire that burned down the house, right? It's not telling you about all the people that rebuilt it in a month, right? It's the thing that's only telling you part of what happened. It may be showing you a picture of a brand new highway, but it doesn't tell you that it only goes for 2 miles and cuts off, you know, in the middle of nowhere. It's partial information. You see that a lot, and what I think is really interesting is you see that a lot in protest coverage. Those of you who've probably been watching some of the BLM protests with a lot of interest here, and you see that in the coverage. All you have to do is go to 2 different TV stations or a couple of different websites, and on one website, you might see information about people marching peacefully, what they're advocating for. On the other website, you're going to see a whole lot about businesses that have been damaged. You're going to see a whole lot about, you know, maybe an argument or a fist fight in the street. So you're going to see things that are very, very different. None of those things were made up. You know, none of them are false, but if they're not told in their proper context, if they're told, if there's a lot of bias, we may end up not understanding what actually happened. If you only see the story about the businesses that are damaged, you're not going to understand that the vast majority of those protests were peaceful. And the people were advocating for, you know, really important rights. If you only see the photos from the peaceful march, you might not understand that there are some business owners in your neighborhood that are really struggling now and have had to close their doors. So you're not going, so it's a barrier to understanding, but it's not the same thing as misinformation. And it's probably that's probably one of the main messages I try to get across to people is we've decided to define misinformation and fake news as being a barrier to understanding, but it's only one barrier. There are these others, and I think it's important to understand what those others are so we can better process the information that we're receiving and understand and pay attention a little bit more, be able to identify. This story feels biased. You only have 2 people quoted in it, and they're both law enforcement agents. So what else is missing from this protest story? Or being able to identify opinion versus bias. So that's really, I think, the first step in combating misinformation is really understanding that. And of course, I think that, and this is probably really simple to all of you in this audience, but I think the best way to combat it is to be generally well informed. Because if you're generally well informed and you read something that just doesn't sound right, you're going to check it out. It's going to raise red flags if you're already well informed. What happens is misinformation, perpetrators of misinformation prey on those who are not particularly well informed. Whether they're not well informed because they're in a country with a free press and they're just not paying attention. Maybe they can't afford access to legitimate news agencies. That's something that some of the panelists talked about the other day. Or maybe they're in a place where they just simply don't have access to a lot of information. So it's much easier to carry out disinformation campaigns, which I know you'll be talking about next week. So of course, being informed is really important. I think looking at sources for information. I actually, as a journalist, it troubles me when I see sources of information that don't admit their point of view. I'm completely okay with with point of view journalism as long as it's disclosed. And I think there's a lot of room for different perspectives and different voices. But you want to look for your source. You know what you're going to get when you go to certain places. Right. So you want to look for sources, and then there are some sources who really do attempt very much to be very balanced. Know who those are too. So looking for who your sources are. I think looking for simple things, very simple things like imagery. Is it a link or an image? It's much harder to fake a whole website than it is to fake a picture. So looking for links or images for information, and then just checking bylines. In legitimate journalists, unless they're for fear of their lives, which happens in many places in the world, but legitimate journalists in societies that have a largely free press, they're going to have a byline. They're going to stand behind their work, and they're going to be available to talk to you about it. So that's another thing to look for as well, along with URLs and fonts. But be forewarned, there are people out there, and I know that Mark's going to talk a little bit more about this. There are people out there with a lot of expertise who can fake Twitter accounts, who can fake newspaper websites. And sometimes it can be hard, even those of us who are in the media, sometimes we have to stop for a minute and determine its legitimacy. So I believe that that Mark is waiting up next, but please, I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Molly. I just wanted to add, it's very interesting about your points on barriers to understanding, and the issue with correcting a mistake is that oftentimes consumers, just like anybody, our brains are wired to remember the original mistake better than the correction. And that also is a huge issue and something that we just can't always control because it's just our brain functionality. So very interesting concepts. Thank you for your points. Mark, if you'd like to go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Mark Graham. As noted, I manage the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive in San Francisco. And I've actually had the honor of hosting a number of visiting groups with Alannah from Global Ties at our headquarters building at 300 Funston, which we no longer are in. But there's after COVID, you're all welcome to come over and visit us. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, and some practical things that we're doing to try to help address issues of misinformation. I'm going to avoid the F news word. I actually think that's part of disinformation campaigns, so I prefer not to perpetuate that. So first of all, the Internet Archive is a nonprofit, as noted. We were formed in 1996 by a man named Brewster Kahle, who had made a fair amount of money in the early days of the internet and decided to turn his attention to the mission of universal access to all knowledge. That's our mission statement. So how do we do that? Well, we take analog information and we digitize it and make it available publicly, and we take born digital information and we preserve it and we make it available publicly. We work in the realm of books, of television news, academic papers, music, video, software, and much of the web. For the web specifically, we have these systems that archive web pages, URLs, more than 1 billion of them a day. And all of that information is gathered together and made available publicly via the Wayback Machine, web.archive.org. Everything I'm going to talk about today is available from the Internet Archive for free. There's no advertising, and it's all there. Just go to archive.org and begin to explore. I think maybe the three themes that I want to focus on are persistence, provenance, and context. As Molly noted, context is a partial antidote to bias. So just note the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive are used by researchers and journalists and students, writers and activists. Hundreds of thousands of people a day come to the site, and there's been multiple thousands of articles either written about our services or referencing us over the last few years. Several hundred alone were referenced in fact checks, for example, just this year, where there's a link to a playback of an archived version of a web resource in the fact check. Because we've been archiving a lot of the web, we can also do things like fix broken links, because the web is by and large a very fragile environment. And things that are published either go away or they change over time in many cases. So we've been able to identify more than 11 million links in Wikipedia articles to external resources and go in and edit them and replace the broken links, which you would have gotten a 404 with an archived version of that web resource back around the time that it was first referenced. I should note that we have more than 800 partners that are libraries, museums, governments, other nonprofits, et cetera, that work with us. They use our Archive It service to do web archiving and to curate their own collections. So there's people ask, how do you decide what to archive? And the answer is there are thousands of different reasons why things get archived, and it's really a matter of just continuing to explore more different ways. So let me jump in a little bit. Save Page Now is a service of the Wayback Machine, a feature of the Wayback Machine, where anyone can enter a URL and hit a return key, and that will be archived in near real time. That's responsible for archiving about 80 million URLs a day. That's a combination of people entering URLs into the web, people filling out a Google Sheet, and then archiving the URLs from that Google Sheet. There's a Wayback Machine browser extension for all the major browsers, and also iOS and Android apps. So there's any one of a number of ways that people can enter URLs or lists of URLs to archive. For example, Columbia Journalism Review came out with an article a few days ago about pink slime. Pink slime is a term that's used to describe kind of these pseudo news sites. And they identified more than 1,200 of them, 2/3 of them launched this year, which are political sites that masquerade as local news sites, often using algorithmically generated quote unquote news articles that promote a particular point of view. And I should note, this is across the board. This isn't just a conservative thing, or liberal thing. It's across the political spectrum, this phenomena of these pink slime websites. Anyway, they published the data set of all the 1,200 URLs in the article in the Columbia Journalism Review, and I was able to archive all of those URLs and all of the outlinks in all of those websites by just simply constructing a Google Sheet and then submitting that to Save Page Now. So what I would say is, if you see something, save something, because you may be the first person to save something that they may go away and other people may want it and benefit from it. So Save Page Now and the other services of the Wayback Machine are example of persistence. But also provenance. As noted, it's easier to spoof an image than it is certain kinds of archives. On the Wayback Machine, on the top right-hand side of every playback URL, there's a link that says about this capture. And if you click on it, you get more detailed information about every page element on that web page. That was used, by example, by the New York Times when they were fact-checking a story about the manufacturer of the guns, some of the guns used in Sandy Hook, and whether or not a particular element on that page which said, this is suitable for military use, had been there, whether that image had been on that page before Sandy Hook. And because of the detailed information, the provenance available from the web archives that we had on that page, they felt confident enough to run with that article. I should also note that because of this too, the provenance tools of the Wayback Machine, assets from our service are admissible in many, many, many courts. The other thing would be context. So, we've been adding features to the Wayback Machine to provide more context, more information about what it is you are seeing on the screen. An example would be, there was a Medium post, about COVID, and it was removed by the service Medium. And it was removed because it violated Medium's COVID policies. And then people began on Facebook, especially on Twitter, to promoting the Wayback Machine archive of that removed web page from Medium. So what we did was we put this banner at the top that said, this archive, this URL was removed from Medium because it violated their COVID content policy, with a link to that policy. And then also, you can see it on the live web here with a link to the live web version of that URL, which returned an error message from Medium. So we think that the answer to bad speech is more context. It's not about just making things unavailable, like it often happens by the larger platforms. Another example would be the so-called Frontline Doctors video that went viral, and YouTube removed and Facebook removed them. What we decided to do was to make it, we kept those videos up, but you had to be logged in to the archive to see them, which means they could not be embedded into other web pages and go viral. And we also added some reviews, some information about the videos written by the Washington Post, by PolitiFact, and by other organizations to provide more context to what was seen there. I just want to also note, I'm going to finish up soon here, a couple more features. One is an ability to take two archives of a web page and present them side by side, and with diffing them using blue and yellow highlighting to show the differences. This was especially useful when Dominique Cummings, an advisor to Boris Johnson, said that he had predicted COVID in a blog post that he had written last year. Well, it turned out that wasn't entirely true. So he had gone back and edited the blog post and inserted that prediction well after the fact. And some enterprising person noticed that and used the Wayback Machine to make that side-by-side comparison, showing the time date stamped before and after. Just two other points here I'll just say, and get to the Q&A. One is, there's an article that came out recently in Current Affairs, and I thought it really illustrated a key dimension of this challenge we have in front of us, which is that more and more, the truth, factual information, researched information that has context and is footnoted and is well thought through, is available to us through paywalled websites. Almost all of the websites that you would think of as high quality news and journalism sites these days are paywalled. You have to pay money to get access to them, and yet at the same time, information that may be more questionable, less reputable, etc., easy to pass around and easy to propagate and amplify on social media is free. So if you think about this like an information diet, it's kind of like the equivalent of junk food. Tasty, cheap calories that maybe aren't very good for you. And I pose this as a general problem that we're facing here today, is that more and more humans are getting more and more of their information from free services that are not necessarily acting in our best interest. And one of the many challenges that we have here, I just also reference one other thing we do at the Internet Archive is, I mentioned books. We've digitized 4 million books. Where we make previews of them available for reference purposes, and on a one-to-one basis, based on those that we own physical copies of, we lend out books with digital rights management. And in recent months, my team has added more than 500,000 links from Wikipedia articles to books at the Internet Archive to help provide foundation for people who want to go deeper and check some of the references that are made in Wikipedia articles. So I'll just stop there to say that my email address, which I put in the chat, is mark@archive.org. And I very, very much want to put the offer out there that the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine are here to serve you, whoever you are. Please do not hesitate to reach out. If there's something you think we should be doing more, better, different, let us know, and we'll see what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That is incredibly interesting. Thank you for the work that you do. It's very important, and you address the importance of providing context. And I think that can also serve to accomplish a lot of things in addition to the numerous other features of the many activities at Internet Archive. So thank you very much. One question that was submitted, and this is open-ended to whomever would like to answer. There seems to be two extremes when it comes to accessing information. Governments shutting down access completely on one extreme and no regulations at the other. Do the panelists have any thoughts on what the perfect amount of governance or regulation for internet and information might be? And in your own respective context? Yes, Molly, go ahead.
I'm going to simply say that no, I don't know. And I'm not really sure that anybody does have the solution and the perfect answer. We're every day we're moving around in the dark. It's a new, these technologies are relatively new. I mean, we've only had smartphones for 13 years. And we've only had access to social media for less than 20. These are relatively new technologies. And that balance, I don't know where it is. And I'm sure there might be some people who have better answers than I do. But I think I just wanted to say, I think that's a question that we all need to ask and we all need to struggle with a bit.
It's a super hard problem, and I don't necessarily have a better answer. But it's some thoughts about this. One is I think we should be cognizant. You say government. Here we're in the U.S. that whatever we do here in the U.S. May be amplified and used as an example in other countries around the world. So I think we need to keep that in mind at all times. I don't know that it's the role of government to shut things down. That's a very dangerous thing. At the same time, there's responsibility for platforms to provide context, to provide provenance and accountability for what's published. I do think there are areas where platforms have responsibility to not make things available. A live shooting situation, a direct threat to a specific named class of people, where the term real world harm can occur. And we've seen this all too often all over the world, where a rumor gets started that one group of people or another group of people have harmed another group, and then physical violence takes place and people get murdered, and there's destruction. I think we need to guard against those kind of things. But I would also say, I think we should be doing on the positive side, flip it around a little bit. We've got a really big problem coming up right now around vaccinations, right? If we're lucky, we will have vaccines available for COVID soon. At the same time, there is a rapidly developing movement in the US and global against vaccinations, distributed by and large by disinformation, but also, we haven't been talking about this, misinformation, intentional false information, for a variety of reasons, including geopolitical reasons and other kind of long kind of challenges, of fights between countries. But this is taking hold. And as we've noted, this idea a lie can travel the world a few times before the truth he can get his boots on, that kind of thing. It's like, this is a real problem right now, where the momentum is around anti-vaccination. So what is the US government doing about this? What is the CDC doing about this? What is the WHO doing about this, et cetera? And the answer, there's an article about this yesterday, is very little. And so there's some catch up that has to happen there. But education, alternative perspectives, real information, credible sources, et cetera, I think is all part of helping to address this very real problem that you outlined.
Richard, I believe you wanted to comment.
Yes, we also have that headache here, or that delicate balance. And for us, the context may be a little bit different, but it's the same thing. Because there's this propaganda, for example, discrediting social media, Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, that there are certain citizens that are saying certain things that someone in power doesn't like, for instance, and they begin to call it abuse of social media. But when you look at the principles of the right to free expression and its limitations and boundaries, you realize that it's not within that. So for us, the context is balancing between, for instance, our digital rights and national security. So here you find that everything else that is done to regulate, to limit, to stifle, and all those things, it's done in the interest of national security. And sometimes national security is not properly defined, it's vague. And we know what national security is. We know what threatens national security and all that. So you find that that narrative now is used to inspire the enactment of repressive internet laws, for instance, and it leads to this cry about the absence of the rule of law. So you see where we are here. When some people come to New York at the United Nations General Assembly, and the people here are crying that we can't assemble, we can't say certain things online, and these people that come to New York claim that we are governing by the rule of law. If you look at these instruments are calling the laws, they have elements that are vague, that are repressive, they are anti-democracy, for example, anti-freedom of expression in particular. And these people are ruling by the rule of law. And this is where the problem is. How do we balance national security and that which citizens are entitled to? The biggest tragedy for us is that we are even just fluffing over a technology that we have no control over. For example, here there's this thing to tax Facebook here in Zambia. It's happening in Uganda. Sorry to mention Uganda because they're not part of this conversation. But they are supposed to tax Facebook, not to tax the Zambians. You get a point. So this is the whole narrative that we are grappling with here over technology that we don't own. That telecommunications companies are not making enough profits because citizens are not making traditional calls. All the profits have gone to internet calls. So we must tax the citizens again for making calls on Messenger, on WhatsApp, and all that. And it's just a disruption that is manipulative to citizens. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. You know, that's incredibly interesting. That was another thing that we had spoken about in our pre-webinar check-in, that is a unique feature of this issue that we here in the United States don't face, that we don't have our government making us need to get a license in order to go on Facebook Live. So it is a very interesting discussion that I wish we had more time for. We are at 9:56 a.m. Pacific time. So just a quick last question, and we can address other questions later on, and we'll send a follow-up email with those answers. But if we could just maybe get one quick answer, two quick answers if they're fast. What are your views on Facebook and Twitter fact-checking or tagging items as being misleading or false news, and what would be like an example of a best practice, or how can they ensure that they are being balanced and accurate in their tagging and not biased, let's say? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Okay, I'll go. We have that narrative here, tagging and this self-publishing and all that. And for us, yes, it's problematic. But in the hands of a few people called journalists who, for example, here publish information, for example, that is not in the public interest. So what we advocate for here, what we are saying is that all this misinformation, all the so-called abuse of social media is basically a reflection of what kind of society we are. Instead of discrediting the online spaces, maybe we should introspect about our own morals as a society, and maybe we are going to stop spreading lies and nudes and all this revenge porn that is going on, because even before the dawn of social media, these things happen. So it is society that must take the responsibility and not necessarily blaming the online spaces. That is our take on that.
That is a very valid point. Molly, did you have something to add?
Just going to say, as long as they focus really on things that are not factual for their flagging, I think that's fine. We get into a little bit of we get into a dangerous area when it starts becoming about items that we agree with, or we start flagging opinion or that sort of thing. But if there's something that is just flat out a falsity, I think that's fine. But then you start to get into the debate of one person's falsity is another person's opinion. But and that becomes a far more complicated social issue, I think, that Richard was referencing.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
I just think there's issues of amplification that they need to be addressed. When I go to Amazon and I'm being promoted anti-vaccination books, when I go to YouTube and I'm being promoted videos that have been intentionally slowed down of Nancy Pelosi speaking, when I go to Twitter today and I still see posts that are up by key politicians that we know have made false representations where there's no flagging. I think those are all opportunities where the platforms have responsibility, have the capacity and capability, and can take measures to reduce the amplification of things that are known to be false or heavily biased, and add context, add information. I just want to note there's an organization called the International Fact-Checking Network, and they just had their annual conference. There are hundreds of fact-checking organizations around the world. There was a new platform announced this week in Brazil, so it's unfortunately only in Portuguese, which is going through and looking through thousands of articles a day, and it's kind of a mis and disinformation alerting system. So better tools, better practices, and just reducing the amplification and the recommendations of information that is by any reasonable person known to be highly biased and or just outright false and misleading.
Thank you so much, appreciate it. Well, we want to send a special thank you to our attendees and to our distinguished panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we have been recording this. We will send out the recording afterwards. Stay tuned for 2 weeks from now on August 26th for our third and final segment on disinformation. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.